I'm Eric, and this is the Commander's Beacon. Today we are discussing a new spoiler from Kaldheim. It's the legendary Gruul creature, Svella Ice Shaper. Svella is a 2/4 snow creature. It's a troll warrior that costs 1 red-green, and Svella has 2 activated abilities. You can pay 3 and tap Svella to create a colorless snow artifact token named Icy Manalith with tap, add 1 mana of any color. You can also pay 6 red-green and tap Svella to look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may cast a spell from among them without paying its mana cost. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Okay, so in the Commander format, there's a few different ways that you can build around Svella, and none of them seem super obvious. And so as a result, I think Svella is actually a really interesting commander. First, again, you can tap Svella and pay 3 mana to make essentially a Manalith. Now, the 3 mana ramp has generally fallen out of favor in our format for more efficient 2 mana ramp, so Manalith isn't a very compelling card anymore. But what about a Manalith that you can create multiple copies of and doesn't take up a card slot in your deck? Well, this sounds better, but remember Svella is red-green, and because we'll have access to green, we'll also be able to play a much more effective mana ramp that doesn't get completely negated by, say, a Cyclonic Rift. Now, one thing I will point out, depending on what your playgroup is comfortable with, is that you could use a lot of mass land destruction. Well, because if you're using Svella to make a bunch of Manalith artifacts, then you can destroy all the lands and you'll still have mana. Well, of course, your opponents will not. Though again, many playgroups aren't generally okay with mass land destruction, so this probably won't be a popular strategy. But it is one thing you could do, and I wanted to point it out. But also notice that Svella is a snow creature, and Svella doesn't just create Manaliths, it creates icy snow Manaliths. So you could potentially make a snow deck around Svella. I will point out though that there aren't too many snow payoffs in Gruul, and the payoffs that do exist don't really seem to adhere to a specific theme. They're kind of all over the place on what they do. For example, we have Glacial Crevices. This is an enchantment that lets you sacrifice a snow mountain to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. Skred is a 1 mana instant that deals damage to target creature equal to the number of snow permanents you control. This is fine, but it's no Swords to Plowshares. The Scrying Sheets is a land that lets you pay 1 and a snow mana and tap it to look at the top card of your library. If that card is snow, you can reveal it and put it into your hand. So overall, you might play some snow payoff cards and other snow cards in your Svella deck, but there aren't really enough of these to build an entire deck around. Now, Svella's last ability lets you cast 1 of the top 4 cards of your library for 8 mana and tapping Svella. Now, this is okay, but Kinnan can do nearly the same thing for 1 less mana, and he ramps you much more quickly than Svella does. Now, that said, Svella's ability is a bit more versatile, since it lets you cast any spell from the top 4, while Kinnan's ability only cares about creatures. Now, if you were building around Svella's second ability, you'd likely include a lot of high CMC cards in your deck to generate as much value from this ability as possible, but again, your options are pretty open as to which type of cards you can use. Now, both of Svella's abilities require that you tap Svella, so on each of your turns you'll often have to choose between either using the first ability to make a Manalith, or the second ability to cast a spell from the top 4 cards of your library. And that matters because if Svella isn't creating snow Manaliths, then we need other sources of ramp, like other green sources of ramp. And then we're almost just playing another big mana Gruul deck, and I'm not really sure that Svella is the best option to command such a deck. So despite this admittedly negative sounding introduction, I am actually really interested in Svella because you do have these multiple options, and it isn't really obvious how you should build around each one. So the deck doesn't build itself, and it really gives you a lot of room to decide where you want to go with it. Now, the direction I'm personally most interested in taking with Svella is a Gruul Artifacts deck, so I'll spend the rest of this video discussing that option. First, Gruul colors are typically not associated with artifact decks, so any artifact deck commanded by Svella will likely look a bit different than most other artifact decks. But how would we build such a deck? Well, Svella can generally make us 1 artifact token every turn, at the very least, for 3 mana, or effectively 2 mana given that snow Manalith that you create can then tap to make 1 more mana. Artifact decks often play around with sacrifice effects, using things like a Mere Retriever, which returns an artifact card from your graveyard to your hand when it dies, or Trading Post, which lets you sacrifice an artifact to draw a card. But I don't know that we want to go too deep into this route with Svella. I mean, our snow Manaliths cost too much mana to be able to just sacrifice them right away for some little payoff, And we can only make one per turn with Svella for the most part, so we won't be generating absurd numbers of artifacts really quickly, at least most of the time. Now despite that, I think that a few sacrifice effects will be worth it here. A Goblin Engineer, for example, lets you sacrifice an artifact to return an artifact with CMC 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, which will give us some added resilience. Now, because our snow manoliths can effectively ramp us, I'm interested in using artifact synergies that can either take advantage of all that mana, or create even more mana. We can create even more mana with cards like Blinkmoth Urn, for example, which gives each player 1 colorless mana at the beginning of their pre-combat main phase for each artifact they control. And so if we're playing an artifact deck, this is obviously going to reward us more than it rewards the other players most of the time. And because Svella can use its activated abilities at any time, once it no longer has summoning sickness anyways, we can use other effects that generate mana during any phase of our turn to churn out those snow manoliths. Frontier Siege, for example, can give us 2 green mana at the beginning of each of our main phases. Braid of Fire has cumulative upkeep, which gives us 1 red mana, again during our upkeep, for each age counter on it. That mana will disappear before our main phase, but we can use it during our upkeep to fuel either one of Svella's abilities. Now once we've generated all this mana and we've got a bunch of snow manolith tokens, we can focus on high mana cost artifact synergies to win the game. The Sihili's Directive is a sorcery that costs 3 red and X, and you reveal the top X cards of your library and put any number of artifact cards with CMC X or less from among them onto the battlefield, and the rest in the graveyard. There's Fathomfleet Swordjack, which deals damage to defending player equal to the number of artifacts you control when it attacks. Now, if we're playing a bunch of other artifacts, a Feedback Bolt can take out a player too. This is a 5 mana instant that deals damage to target player equal to the number of artifacts you control. There's cards like Arcbound Crusher. This is an artifact creature that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever another artifact enters the battlefield. And Darksteel Juggernaut is an indestructible artifact creature that attacks each turn if able and has power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts you control. Now, of course, with all that mana that Svella can generate, there's also non-artifact mana sinks for all that mana too, like Comet Storm and Banefire. But even if we aren't building around Svella's second ability, if we're focusing more on the manolith creation instead, that second ability is still a decent mana sink when you need it. And because it can be used at instant speed, it'll similarly allow instant speed casting of things like creatures, artifacts, and sorceries, which wouldn't normally have flash. And again, even if we aren't focusing on snow permanents in this type of build, those manolith tokens that Svella creates are snow permanents, so you might include some of the most effective snow payoffs. Sunstone, for example, is an artifact version of Glacial Crevices. It lets you create a fog effect by paying 2 mana and sacrificing a snowland. And there's, every reason in this deck to use snowlands if it's within your budget and if you've got even a few snow payoffs. Finally, we can focus on effects that untap Svella to make those snow manoliths even faster. Note that you'll still have to pay the 3 mana cost each time you tap Svella to make an icy manolith, so you'll still be limited in some ways. 1,000-Year Elixir, for example, is an artifact that lets you pay 1 and tap it to untap a creature, and it also gives Svella a form of haste to use its activated abilities on the turn that you cast it. Sword of the Parents is an equipment that lets you untap the equipped creature, but it does cost you 3 mana each time you do that. And then there's Illusionist's Bracers, that doesn't untap Svella, but it does let you make 2 manoliths every time you activate its ability, rather than just 1. Or of course, 2 activations of looking at the top 4 cards of your library and casting one of them. But anyways, that is my brief introduction to Svella Ice Shaper. Again, I think this is a really cool commander because there's so many ways to build it, from snow to landfall to artifacts, and some of these are new avenues for Gruul that it couldn't do very well before. But that is all I've got for today. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.